So, our chapter and the introduction to our chapter is Dombrowski talking about Christian and political liberalism, which is directly comes from John Rawls and his philosophy, which is what the chapter essentially centers itself around. And Dombrowski uses the introduction to make it very clear that uh, Christian and the political liberalism that he's going to be talking about is distinct and different from what we think of American liberalism or American liberals, as we often call them. He next goes on to the topic of pre-liberalist thinkers and sort of who preceded John Rawls' ideals, and that basically their big piece that they all shared was that there was the good, the truth, and the correct way of thinking, and that the people that understood this correct way of thinking, the good, were the people that needed to be in power. And this included people who disagreed on a lot of other things, like St. Thomas Aquinas and Plato and tons of other people that he mentions. And while they differed on a lot of topics, they were very clear on this sort of one thing that sparks Christian and political liberalism.
I'm going to talk about liberal political theory. So when we have two competing religions or comprehensive of the good, each claim to have the truth. For example, Islam and Christianity in the history had a lot of conflicts. Instead of one of them eventually wins the authority through war over the other, we can simply develop a political theory that will allow adherents to competing religions or comprehensive doctrines to coexist in peace. And in contrast to pre-liberal political thinkers, political liberals see toleration not as a vice but as a virtue, and this key virtue is necessary for people not only to survive but to flourish in a state with a plurality of religions or comprehensive doctrines. So Rawls and other political liberal concentrates in politics on justice or fairness in construct to the good or the truth of any comprehensive doctrine, whether religion or non-religious, or the right way to behave.
Thomas Podge states that a Christian liberal view believes that religious believers respect the duty of civility not in spite of their religious beliefs, but because of them. So he states that all groups of people should be able to coexist with each other, and he explains this in a way that explains that some people might think it's contradictory to believe in a religious view and also tolerate religious views, but it's actually more Christian to be able to believe strongly in your own religion and also be able to accept and support other people's different religious beliefs.
So on the section of love, Professor John Rawls talks about what citizens could be good people in a fair and just society in his writing, A Theory of Justice. John Rawls is an American professor who deals with moral and political philosophy in the liberal tradition. In his Theory of Justice, he outlines a social contract that would outline the abstract principles that would govern a fair and just society in the eyes of a Christian liberal. In his thesis, he talks about the idea of a veil of ignorance in which ordinary liberals abandon their principles about themselves and to think about which principles of justice we would agree to if we had to radically change how we thought and how we governed ourselves. Pretty much he's talking about change who we are and how we think. The idea is that injustice in religious matters is less likely if the principles of justice are chosen in a fair decision-making process where our individual biases are held at check. So in his thesis, he also goes on to talk about the equal liberty principle, in which in a just society, primary goods are distributed equally. And in his context, primary goods are things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of opportunity, and so on. He also goes on to talk about the opportunity principle, in which no one is barred from anything based on their religion, their sex, or their skin color. He also talks about the word agape, which is an ancient Latin word for love, and he uses this word in dealing with social justice. In his thesis, he outlines a contract in which he believes that would govern a fair and just society. It's located on page 57 of the book, and it deals with issues like housing, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, other things he talks about in his thesis. Many critics accuse him of blending religion and socialist propaganda, which isn't true. Rawls is just trying to promote a society in which everyone is equal and is full of like-minded Christian liberal citizens. The list that I talked about on page 57 features a just society which is pointed towards a realistic utopia, which is both domestic and international.
In the Christian liberal perspective, one of the ways we view sin is through its effect on community. Sin is described by Rawls as the destruction of community, whereas faith is an affirmation and enhancing of community. With this understanding, we can engage the root of sin and the aforementioned destruction of community in one major concept: passionate self-interest. This self-interest manifests itself in different ways, two of which are egoism and egotism. Now, egoism is all about self-interest, and in this context, it affects how we treat others in community. Egoism devolves a person-to-person relationship into a person-object relationship. It is through this that egotism is born, as it distorts a person's perceived self-importance by elevating it over in others. With these two concepts in mind, we can see what sin looks like within a liberal community. Sin is treating people like objects, like they're less than. According to Rawls, it's only through subordinating our own self-interest, our power, and putting it towards societal goals, reasonable aims as he puts it, that a liberal society stands a chance of thriving.
In conclusion, a consideration of the second way can be introduced in terms of the oddity that someone who is influenced by some version of the materialistic reductionism might nonetheless belong to Amnesty International. After that, we can ask ourselves why we view human beings as politically free and equal and worthy of moral respect. And there is 3 stages in Rawls' career relative to this question. First of all, Rawls gives abundant evidence of support for the thesis that human beings are made in the image of God. Hence, there is something semi-divine about a human life that makes it special. Secondly, there is also the Kantian view of the human person in a theory of justice. And third, it's understandable why Rawls in political liberalism moves away from the comprehensive Kantian view of the human person in political philosophy.